Today, I want to talk about world predictions that have caught my attention very strongly. In the last few days, several situations have started to appear with great intensity when I observed the collective global scenario. These are events connected to international conflicts, political changes, economic instability, serious accidents, investigations, diplomatic movements, and decisions that may affect several countries at the same time. This is not about one single subject. There are many different points happening almost at once. And when that happens, it usually means we are entering a period of stronger movement, faster changes, and situations that can quickly grow beyond what people expect. The United States, Israel, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and Africa appear very strongly in these predictions. Some situations involve attacks and military tensions. Others show the fall of important leaders, diplomatic problems, economic pressure, and events that can gain worldwide attention very quickly. There are also issues directly connected to ordinary people, such as urban violence, public safety problems, population displacement between countries, migration caused by crisis or conflict, and situations that create collective anger and strong public reaction. These are strong predictions. Some are delicate, some are uncomfortable, but all of them deserve attention. Very often before major events happen, the global atmosphere begins to show signs first. The signals appear before the headlines. The pressure starts before the explosion. And that is exactly what we are going to analyze here today. Sometimes people feel that something is changing even before they can explain it. Governments become more tense, markets react strangely, leaders change their tone, and entire populations begin to feel instability without fully understanding where it is coming from. That is why it is important to observe carefully. Because when many signs start appearing at the same time, it is rarely a coincidence. It usually means that something bigger is already moving behind the scenes. So pay close attention to each point, because some of these movements may begin to appear much faster than most people imagine. Some of them may already be happening right now. At any moment, an attack may happen in a public place, an environment with heavy movement and large circulation of people, a place where people normally feel safe, such as a station, shopping area, public square, transportation hub, or another crowded location. Civilians are directly affected. The situation creates immediate panic, confusion, and a strong emotional reaction. People running, emergency services responding quickly, authorities trying to control the situation, and intense media coverage spreading fast across the world. This is not something that stays local. It gains international attention very quickly. Other countries may respond by increasing security measures, reinforcing surveillance, and raising alert levels in strategic public spaces. Whenever this type of event happens, the consequence is often bigger than the event itself, because fear spreads faster than facts, and the global atmosphere changes immediately. There is also a strong indication that this event creates political reactions, public pressure, and discussions about security failures and responsibility. This is why this prediction carries so much weight. In the United States, an assassination gains global attention. This does not appear as an ordinary crime. It may involve a public figure, someone connected to politics, a person with influence, or someone linked to sensitive information that should not have become public. This is the kind of event that opens doors that were supposed to remain closed. After the incident, deeper investigations begin. The focus is no longer only on who committed the act, but on who wanted that person silenced. There is a strong indication of hidden interest behind the event. Possibility of connections to larger political, financial, or institutional agendas. Names that were protected may begin to surface. People who were never expected to be involved may suddenly become part of the investigation. Hidden information starts being revealed. Documents, private conversations, old investigations, and previously ignored evidence may return to the center of attention. This creates a much larger impact than the crime itself, because when something like this happens in the United States, the world watches, markets react, governments pay attention, international media turns it into a major global story. And that is why this prediction is so significant. It is not only about death, it is about exposure. There is also an internal problem inside the United States. Important decisions begin to be questioned. This points to instability inside institutions, government structures, or strategic sectors that usually operate away from public visibility. Possible division within major institutions or inside the government itself. Conflicts that were hidden begin to surface. Disagreements become public. Internal pressure grows stronger. There is also a strong indication of information leaks. Confidential details, documents, recordings, private decisions, or strategic conversations may be exposed. And when internal information starts leaking, instability grows fast because trust begins to break. The population notices, political tension increases, public confidence becomes weaker, and what looked like a stable structure starts showing cracks. This prediction feels directly connected to the assassination, as if one event pulls the other, as if the death is only the beginning of something much larger, not necessarily an immediate collapse, but a visible process of internal weakening, stronger political division, more aggressive public disputes, exposure of hidden structures and behind-the-scenes movements. And when hidden structures begin to surface, everything changes. When this information appears, it does not show an ordinary street crime. It shows something involving an important person, someone who holds influence, someone connected to politics, to the system itself, or even to information that should never have come to light. This is not the type of case that is forgotten quickly. It feels like an event that opens a door that had been closed for a very long time, as if one death forces hidden truths to rise to the surface. Because after the death, the focus stops being only about the crime itself and becomes something much bigger. Who wanted this person silenced? Who benefited from this disappearance? Who was afraid of what this person knew? And that is exactly where the situation begins to grow. Old investigations return. Cases that seemed forgotten begin to move again. Names start circulating. People who were previously protected, untouchable, or operating quietly behind the scenes begin to be observed more closely. There is a very strong indication of masterminds behind the event, not just the person who carried out the act. This prediction is not about execution alone. It is about those who gave the order, those who needed silence, those who had something to lose. That is why this prediction carries so much weight. It would not be just another assassination. It would be an event capable of creating political crisis, public exposure, and even important changes inside structures of power. Because when something like this happens in the United States, the impact never stays there alone. The entire world watches, financial markets react, governments pay attention, international media turns it into a major headline, questions grow fast. Pressure increases, and silence becomes impossible to maintain. Alongside this prediction, another one appears, possibly even more delicate, an internal problem inside the American system itself. This may be inside the government, inside major institutions, or even inside sectors that normally operate far from public visibility. Places where decisions are made quietly, places where exposure is usually avoided. I see leaks. Information that was hidden begins to surface. This may involve documents, private recordings, confidential reports, accusations, or even people deciding to speak after a very long time in silence. Sometimes one person talks, and that opens everything. Sometimes one file appears, and the entire structure starts shaking, and that creates division. Because when an internal structure begins to crack, the problem stops being only political and becomes institutional. People notice. Public trust weakens. Confidence in the system starts to fall. And that creates even more tension. Especially because this prediction does not appear isolated. It comes immediately after the assassination, as if one event pulls the other. As if that death was only the beginning of something much larger, like the visible part of a much deeper conflict. And when I observe this sequence, it becomes clear that the United States enters a period of strong internal instability. Not necessarily something immediate like total collapse, but a visible process of weakening, more aggressive public disputes, stronger political division, exposure of hidden negotiations, behind-the-scenes movements becoming impossible to hide. And when behind-the-scenes structures begin to appear, many things change. because power depends on silence. And once silence breaks, everything moves. This is the first major prediction, and it does not come lightly. The second strong prediction appears in Israel and across the Middle East. Here, the energy does not show stability. It shows accumulated tension. And when a prediction repeats itself with this level of intensity, it usually means this is not a small or temporary issue. It means something is close to escalating. I see the possibility of a large-scale attack. This is not an isolated incident, nor a small border conflict. It is something that immediately attracts international attention. It may involve an urban area, a strategic region, or even a highly sensitive point that provokes a fast and powerful response. When something like this happens in Israel, the impact never remains limited to the country itself. Other nations become involved. Official statements begin. International organizations take positions. Diplomatic pressure increases, and tension rises very quickly. The most important part here is understanding that this prediction is not only about the attack itself, it is about the consequence. Because what comes after may be even greater than the event itself. Military response, diplomatic pressure, changes in the political balance of the region, and all of this directly affects the entire Middle East. When I observe this prediction more carefully, another layer also appears, an internal situation inside Israel itself. Political pressure increases. Internal decisions generate dissatisfaction. It feels as if there has already been ongoing wear and tension for some time, and a new event simply accelerates everything. This may indicate crisis inside the government itself, shifts in political positioning, or much stronger pressure coming from the population. In other words, this is not only external tension, there is also internal tension. And that makes everything far more delicate. Because when a country faces pressure from outside and inside at the same time, instability grows much faster. And that is exactly what appears here. Right after that, the reading moves to Spain. Here, the scenario is different. It does not show war, it shows popular revolt, protests, demonstrations, social unrest. The energy shows crowded streets, growing dissatisfaction, and difficulty maintaining control. This usually happens when the population reaches a limit. It may be connected to the economy, political decisions, rising cost of living, unemployment, or unpopular measures that generate strong public reaction. And the important point is that this does not feel like something sudden. It shows accumulation, as if the situation has been building for a long time, and now it reaches the point of overflow. People no longer tolerate silence. I see confrontation. I see strong pressure on authorities. I see images spreading far beyond Spain, drawing the attention of other European countries. Because when an important country enters social convulsion, neighboring nations watch immediately. They know instability can spread. And together with this comes another concern, the economic impact. Because strong protests and social instability affect trade, tourism, investment, and international confidence. Businesses slow down. Investors become cautious. Governments begin to react. And uncertainty grows. That is why this prediction for Spain is not only about protest. It is about internal exhaustion creating external consequences. It is about a country reaching a breaking point. And when we connect this with Israel and the Middle East, it becomes clear that the global scenario starts becoming much more sensitive. Different regions, different causes, but the same pattern, pressure increasing at the same time. We are still at the beginning. But these movements already show that this year will not be calm. Now the prediction turns very strongly toward Portugal. And here, two very clear warnings appear. The first is a large-scale fire. This does not show something small, isolated, and quickly resolved. It shows a fire that spreads fast, with initial difficulty in controlling it and a strong emergency response. The energy points especially to the northern region of Portugal. It may involve forest areas, more distant rural regions, or even locations close to urban zones, which increases concern even more. When a fire of this size happens, it is not only the flames that draw attention. There is evacuation, there is fear, there is material loss, there is pressure on emergency teams, there is intense mobilization of firefighters and rescue services, and most importantly, there is public impact. because when images of a major fire begin to circulate, the situation quickly gains international visibility. People start talking, news channels repeat the images. Authorities are pressured for answers and fast action. This becomes much bigger than a local incident. It becomes a national concern, and sometimes even an international one. The second strong point in Portugal involves an accident with major public emotion. Here, the prediction shows something connected to the movement of people. It may involve a tour bus, a religious group, pilgrims, or even a collective trip that ends in a tragic way. I see a significant number of people involved. This does not feel like a quiet, isolated accident. It feels like something that becomes national news, creates deep public emotion, and generates debate. Families affected, communities shocked, public attention focused on what happened. Depending on the situation, it may even raise questions about structure, responsibility, negligence, or failures that could have been avoided. People begin asking, could this have been prevented? Who is responsible? Why was nothing done before? And that increases the repercussion even more, because when tragedy meets possible negligence, public reaction becomes much stronger. This prediction carries that kind of weight. But Portugal does not stop there. Another strong prediction appears connected to violence against women. A very serious case, a crime that reaches national proportion. It may be a femicide or an extremely violent situation that awakens collective outrage. When this prediction appears, it is not only speaking about the crime itself, it speaks about the reaction, the entire country discussing it, the press applying pressure, the population demanding answers, people feeling that this case represents something much bigger than one isolated event. It becomes symbolic, as if that situation represents a problem that has existed for a long time and in that moment explodes in front of everyone. That is why this prediction feels so heavy. It is not only a police case. It is an event that touches the collective emotional state of the country. It creates public debate, social pressure, and a strong demand for justice. And when a case reaches that level, it changes the national conversation. Alongside this, I also see an increase in urban violence. More aggressive situations gaining visibility, cases that begin attracting public attention and increasing the general feeling of insecurity. People become more alert. Fear becomes more visible in everyday life. Events that were once seen as isolated start forming a pattern. And when multiple predictions appear in the same place, fire, accident, crime with national impact, and growing social tension, it usually means that country enters a heavier and more sensitive period. This does not mean total destruction, but it does mean attention, because important events begin concentrating there. And Portugal appears exactly like that, as an important warning point inside Europe. A country that demands observation because several significant situations begin happening at the same time. For Europe as a whole, the main issue does not begin with war. It begins with the economy. There is a very strong concern involving economic decisions that will need to be made quickly. When this prediction appears, it shows governments discussing urgent measures. These are not calm, long-term planned decisions. They are reactions to pressure that is already happening. It may involve rising costs, energy difficulties, supply problems, or accumulated financial exhaustion that has been building for some time. Countries such as Germany, France, and Italy feel this much more strongly because any significant change in these centers affects the entire European structure. When one of these pillars shakes, the rest of the continent feels it immediately. The reading shows a special concern with energy. And when this prediction appears, it speaks about something that directly reaches the population. Higher utility bills, difficulty in supply, pressure on companies and industries, factories slowing down, businesses becoming more cautious, families feeling the weight in everyday expenses. When energy enters crisis, the problem does not remain technical. It becomes social, because it affects work, transportation, consumption, and daily life itself. People feel it in real life, not just in headlines. And that creates dissatisfaction. Because when the basic structure becomes expensive or unstable, social pressure grows very fast. That is why this prediction is important. It is not only about economy, it is about daily survival becoming harder. I also see a significant fatal event happening somewhere in Europe. This may be a serious accident, a structural collapse, or some major visible event that causes strong public emotion. It does not appear political. It appears physical, concrete, immediate, something people can see, something that interrupts normal life and forces media attention. A collapse, a disaster, a tragedy that immediately becomes the center of discussion. When something like this happens, debates usually begin very quickly. Questions about responsibility, questions about safety, questions about previous failures that may have been ignored. People ask, could this have been prevented? Who failed? Why was action not taken earlier? This is the kind of event that leaves a mark, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because of what it exposes afterward. At the same time, the financial market begins to respond. Movements outside the normal pattern, rapid fluctuations, investors acting with caution, confidence becoming weaker. This does not necessarily mean an immediate collapse, but it clearly shows a period of instability. And when multiple crises appear together, political pressure, energy concerns, accidents, and social unrest, the market reacts, and that reaction does not stay inside Europe alone. Other countries feel it. Global markets respond. International confidence shifts. The entire world watches. Because Europe remains one of the central pillars of the global economy, any instability there spreads quickly. Another important point appears in maritime routes, tension involving commercial ships. This may involve attacks, sabotage, strategic blockages, or pressure on major export and import routes. This is serious because the impact does not stay only at sea. When ships stop, commerce feels it immediately. Prices rise, deliveries are delayed, governments are forced to respond. Supply chains become unstable, and people begin to feel the consequence without even realizing where it started. That is why this connects directly to the economic crisis already appearing before. One prediction pulls the next. Nothing is isolated. Energy affects industry. Industry affects markets. Markets affect governments. Governments affect populations. Everything is connected. That is why, when I look at Europe, the main word is not collapse, it is pressure. A sequence of events forcing governments and populations to react quickly. Constant decisions, constant adjustments, constant tension. And when this kind of pressure lasts for too long, larger changes usually come afterward. Because prolonged pressure always transforms structure. And Europe appears exactly in that moment, not at the end of the crisis, but at the point where the weight begins to be impossible to ignore. For Europe as a whole, the main subject does not begin with war. It begins with the economy. There is a very strong concern involving economic decisions that will need to be made quickly. When this prediction appears, it shows governments discussing urgent measures. These are not calm, carefully planned decisions made over time. They are immediate responses to pressure that is already happening. This may involve rising costs, energy difficulties, supply shortages, inflation, or financial exhaustion that has been building for a long time. Countries such as Germany, France, and Italy feel this much more strongly because any major change in these centers affects the entire European structure. When one of these economic pillars becomes unstable, the rest of Europe feels the impact almost immediately. That is why this prediction carries so much importance. The reading shows a particularly strong concern involving energy. And when this kind of prediction appears, it is talking about something that reaches ordinary people directly. Higher electricity and gas bills, difficulty with supply, pressure on businesses and industries, factories slowing down, companies becoming more cautious, households feeling the weight of daily expenses increasing. When energy enters crisis, the problem does not stay technical. It becomes social because it affects work, transportation, consumption, production, and everyday life itself. People feel it in real life, not only through political speeches or financial reports. And that creates dissatisfaction. Because when the cost of basic living becomes heavier, social tension grows very fast. People become more reactive, governments become pressured, and public patience becomes shorter. That is why this is not only an economic issue, it becomes a social issue. I also see an important fatal event happening somewhere in Europe. This may be a serious accident, a structural collapse, or some major visible event that creates strong public emotion. It does not appear political, it appears physical, concrete, and impossible to ignore, something people can see immediately, something that interrupts normal life and forces media attention. It could be a collapse, a transportation tragedy, a major accident, or a structural failure that creates shock and national attention. When something like this happens, public discussion changes quickly. Questions about responsibility begin, questions about safety, questions about previous warnings that may have been ignored. People begin asking, could this have been prevented? Who failed? Why was action not taken earlier? This is the kind of event that leaves a mark, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because of what it reveals afterward. Sometimes one major accident exposes years of negligence, and that is why this prediction feels so heavy. At the same time, the financial market begins to respond. Fluctuations outside the normal pattern, rapid movements, investors acting with caution, confidence becoming weaker. This does not necessarily mean an immediate collapse, but it clearly shows a period of instability, a moment where markets stop trusting easy predictions. When several crises appear together, political pressure, energy concerns, accidents, and social unrest, the financial system reacts. And that reaction does not stay inside Europe alone. Other countries feel it. Global markets respond. International investors become cautious. Confidence changes quickly. The entire world watches because Europe remains one of the central structures of the global economy. Any instability there creates consequences far beyond its borders. That is why this prediction matters internationally. Another important point appears in maritime routes, tension involving commercial ships. This may involve attacks, sabotage, strategic blockages, or pressure on major export and import routes. This is serious because the impact does not remain only at sea. When ships stop, commerce feels it immediately. Prices rise, deliveries are delayed, governments are forced to respond, supply chains become unstable, industries begin to feel shortages, consumers begin to feel higher costs, and often people do not even realize where the problem started. That is why this connects directly to the economic crisis already shown before. One prediction pulls the next. Nothing is isolated. Energy affects industry. Industry affects markets. Markets affect governments. Governments affect daily life. Everything is connected. That is why, when I look at Europe, the main word is not collapse. It is pressure, a sequence of events forcing governments and populations to react quickly. Constant decisions, constant adjustments, constant tension, no real pause. And when this kind of pressure continues for too long, larger changes usually come afterward, because prolonged pressure always transforms structure. And Europe appears exactly in that moment, not at the end of the crisis, but at the point where the weight becomes impossible to ignore. For Russia and Ukraine, these two countries continue appearing very strongly, and that is not a coincidence. When the same region keeps showing up repeatedly, it usually means there is still an important turning point approaching. Here, the main prediction is not simply the continuation of conflict, it is a change of leadership. There is a clear indication of a fall. At least one important leadership figure loses strength or leaves their position. This may happen politically, through internal pressure, international exhaustion, diplomatic weakening, or events that completely damage the support structure around that person. When I observe this prediction, I do not see stability. I see replacement. As if one phase is ending and another is beginning immediately after. And this can happen either in Russia or in Ukraine. The most important thing to understand is that this change does not happen peacefully. It comes with crisis. When a leadership falls in a scenario like this, the impact is not only political. It affects international negotiations, it affects the economy, it affects global security, and that is why the entire world watches. Because when power changes in this region, the consequences travel far beyond borders. I also see a major internal event happening inside Russia. At first, it is not fully exposed. It feels as if something happens behind the scenes first and only later becomes visible to the public. This may involve political structure, military movement, strategic decisions, or an internal development with major consequences. Something important moves quietly before the world is allowed to see it, and when it finally becomes public, it creates international repercussion. It does not go unnoticed. It becomes a subject of global attention. Governments react. Analysts begin to speculate. International media focuses immediately. Because when Russia moves internally, the world pays attention. And this prediction carries exactly that kind of weight. Ukraine remains directly connected to this. The situation does not remain the same. There is a change of strategy, a shift in positioning, or an important advance that modifies the current dynamic. This is why this prediction is not about repetition. It is about a turning point. Something changes, a movement that alters the balance. And that change affects the rest of Europe, because Ukraine is no longer only a regional issue. It has become a central point of global strategy. Every movement there creates consequences elsewhere. That is why this prediction feels like transition, not continuation, not more of the same, but a real shift. At the same time, a very strong connection appears between Africa and Europe. But here, it is not only partnership, it shows diplomatic tension. There may be broken alliances, political distance, or an African country positioning itself against an older European influence. It feels like a stronger movement of independence, a clear message of political repositioning, as if a country or region is saying, we will no longer accept the old structure in the same way. This draws attention because it is not a military conflict. It is a strategic conflict. And strategic conflicts often change international relationships more deeply than open war, because they change influence, they change power, they change who decides and who follows. And that transforms diplomacy itself. But alongside this tension, growth also appears. Africa emerges as a continent that gains strength in the coming years. More investment, more international attention, more economic interest, more strategic value. Countries that were ignored begin attracting global focus. Resources become more valuable. Political importance increases. But before that growth becomes visible, turbulence comes first. Political changes, external pressure, disputes over natural resources, international interests becoming stronger, competition for influence. It is exactly during this difficult process that the continent begins changing its position in the global scenario. And this will be very important in the coming years, because Africa does not appear here only as a place of conflict. It appears as a place of transformation, a continent moving from being observed to becoming central, and that changes everything. Now the prediction closes with two very important points: Brazil and international diplomatic movements. Brazil appears directly connected to Portugal. It does not show distance, it shows rapprochement. This may involve trade agreements, diplomatic decisions, or even issues related to migration and the permanence of Brazilians living in Portuguese territory. Both countries appear taking similar positions or joining together around a specific subject that gains wider international attention. This stands out because it does not feel like something small. It is a more strategic movement. It may involve the economy, the movement of people, or an international position regarding a larger global scenario. There is a sense that both nations may need to respond together to something bigger happening around them. And when Brazil and Portugal appear this way, it usually means the consequences go beyond simple diplomacy. It becomes a broader political and economic movement. At the same time, another diplomatic break appears somewhere else. An agreement that was already established begins to collapse. A relationship between countries weakens or breaks quickly. Trust disappears. Political distance grows. And this may generate a chain reaction, because when an important agreement breaks, other countries immediately begin to observe. Markets react. Official statements begin. Governments reposition themselves. New alliances start forming. Strategic interests change. And this connects directly with everything that appeared before. Nothing is separate. One diplomatic break creates consequences in trade. Trade affects markets. Markets affect political decisions affect populations. Everything is connected. That is why this prediction carries so much importance. Sometimes one broken alliance changes the direction of an entire region. International organizations also appear strongly here. Institutions such as the United Nations and other major global organizations emerge making important public statements, not necessarily as a solution, but as an attempt to position themselves in the face of growing conflicts and rising tensions. This may involve the Middle East, Europe, Russia, Ukraine, or even situations connected to human rights and international security. When these institutions begin speaking more strongly, it usually means the situation has already gone beyond the limit of silence. It means the issue is too large to be ignored. Pressure becomes public. Diplomatic language becomes stronger. The world starts paying closer attention because international organizations usually speak louder when the global balance becomes unstable. And that is exactly what appears here. Another prediction also appears, and it may be one of the strongest: the feeling of injustice. This prediction does not point to one specific place. It points to a collective emotional reaction. Something happens, and the general feeling becomes this: this was unjust. This may involve war, it may involve political decisions, it may involve crimes, corruption, humanitarian situations, or public actions that create strong moral outrage. But the reaction will be collective indignation. People feel it. The media amplifies it. Public pressure grows. International debate expands. And when injustice reaches international scale, it stops being a local problem. It becomes a global discussion because people no longer see it as an isolated event. They see it as a symbol of something much bigger, and that changes the level of reaction completely. Finally, there is one very clear prediction. The world enters a period of rapid change. Leaders fall, conflicts increase, economies reorganize themselves, new alliances emerge, power structures begin to shift. This is not one isolated event. It is a sequence, a chain of movements happening one after another. And when several predictions point in the same direction, it usually means we are entering a phase of global reorganization. The United States, Israel, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Ukraine, Europe, Africa, and also Brazil all appear connected inside this same movement, each one with its own role, each one with its own consequence, each one influencing the next. And when all of this begins at the same time, the scenario stops looking like coincidence. It becomes transformation, not temporary instability, not isolated headlines, but a real period of change that reshapes the international landscape. And that is why these predictions deserve attention, because sometimes history changes quietly first, before the world realizes it is already happening.